In this video, we're taking a look at an extremely wild Kellison J6 Panther flip-top drag car that was raced in the late 60s and early 70s in Nashville, Tennessee, and then was stashed away for more than 30 years before being brought back to life and put back on the drag strip. This car started as nothing more than a dream from Dr. Randall Zorn, an optometrist from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, just outside of Nashville. Now, he had picked up the racing bug after moving to Tennessee. He had spent time previously in Colorado, North Dakota, South Dakota, and when he settled in Tennessee, he picked up the racing bug and had this car built from scratch, basically. So the idea was to take a Kellison J6 Panther body, which was available in the 1960s as a kit car that you would put on an earlier Corvette chassis and running gear, and it was a custom fiberglass body with a really cool sloped back and a long nose. It really was a timeless sports car, and these bodies were used for road racing and also for drag racing. So he ordered his body and then had John Albright build a chassis for it, and ultimately they designed this thing so that it would have an operating door on the driver's side, but also so that it would tilt up like a funny car. So this car was actually intended to be run in the altered class because at that time funny cars typically had nitro burning supercharged engines, and that was never part of the recipe for this car. It was built with a road racing style engine, a Chevrolet DZ302. Now the small cubic inches put this car into the C category in the altered division, and in his case it was a 302 with high compression. It had a roller cam in it, and it had Hilborn mechanical fuel injection. The car's current owner, Robert Walker, was working out of town. He's based out of the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, and he was working in Murfreesboro and happened to see this car, and a couple of guys had just picked it up from Randall Zorn's estate, and they were just looking to sell this car, make a couple of bucks on it, and they did. They sold it to Robert. He bought it basically right there on the spot and took this thing home and started updating it slightly without destroying any of the car's patina or originality. I first saw this car in 2009 at Donnie Johnson's chassis shop, and this thing was getting just some regular service and updates and getting checked out before Robert actually put it back onto the track. So you can see here it's got brand new Krager wheels, it's got brand new tires on it. They've got the engine covered up, but for the most part this is the original DZ302 that was in the car when he bought it. So, you know, a lot of originality here and necessary updates to make this thing safe and legal to race on a regular basis. One of the coolest things that came with this car is this giant poster board that tells all about it. Dr. Randall Zorn of Murfreesboro. It tells about the Kellison, the Albright engineering chassis, the 302 engine, and then here an interesting part is the transmission. It had a Fairbanks clutch turbo, so you would actually launch with the clutch pedal with this type of transmission. Now Robert actually changed that to just a standard automatic transmission to kind of simplify this car's running gear, but he kept the narrowed Oldsmobile rear end, the 538 gears, all of that stuff is still remaining, and this thing actually had some pretty high-tech parts on it. It had Carrera coilovers on the front with a solid axle, and then the rear had that Oldsmobile rear end, which was really common for the day, but it had a pair of Coney coilovers, which was pretty high tech at the time. You can see also on here that the paint is by G.C. Baskin, and the best ET to date was 1001 at 136 miles an hour. And it even says down here on the bottom that it was for sale. The investment as a car and truck was $19,000, and they will sacrifice for $16,000, which was a ton of money in the early 70s for a race car. So, you know, this thing was a pretty high-end car compared to some. You can see the chassis work on this thing is really immaculate, and the body, you know, is a pretty exotic-looking car, even though there were several other Kellisons running in the area at the time, including Larry Stewart's car, which ran for several years at a national level. So there's not a whole lot of pictures of this car back in the day, but we do have a really neat newspaper clipping from a local newspaper in 1972 where this car won an award at a local show, and you can see it on display here on the back of a ramp truck. Even though it's not a color picture, you get the idea. This car was a showpiece. After about this time frame, this car didn't go to the track anymore, and it stayed in storage for many, many years until this car left the Zorn estate. So really a wild story that this thing exists today and that it's still so functional. I mean, the car was 100% complete. And the fact that Robert Walker did what he did and didn't ruin the aesthetics is amazing. He put this car back on the track, keeping the patina, keeping the original look. I would have loved to have seen this car back in the day when the paint was in good shape, because it's got a lot of detail work, a lot of hand lettering, a lot of pinstriping, and a lot of just cool details that still live on today. But you can see obviously that a lot of this paint has started flaking off. It started coming apart. You can see that parachute mounted on the deck lid, and while that's not necessary for the 8th mile runs that Robert's doing today, it probably was necessary back in the 60s and 70s when this car was running, because a lot of the tracks had short shutdown areas, and this car is built with no front brakes whatsoever, so you're only relying on drum rear brakes out back. So that parachute probably got deployed back in the day when Dr. Zorn was running this car. That was one of the upgrades Robert did right off the bat, was adding disc brakes to that Oldsmobile rear end, and he had Donnie Johnson build him a custom wheelie bar. Now he did end up running it with the mechanical fuel injection for a few years, but later swapped that to an intake and carburetor just for simplicity. On the inside, you can see some fresh sheet metal here and a little tiny racing seat with a metal flake seat cover, an old school steering wheel. You know, it's pretty bare bones inside of here. There's not a lot going on. Some Kellisons that I've seen were center steer, kind of like a funny car, but this car was set up with a wide chassis so that it actually has a left side driving position. Even though I love the historical side of this car, the fact of the matter is that Robert Walker has raced this car much more than Dr. Zorn ever raced it in the 60s and 70s. And that's not a knock on Dr. Zorn. He had a pretty serious career, and this car probably was just a hobby for him. And even though he invested a lot of money in it, this wasn't something that he took to the track every time the gate was open. So, you know, there's not a lot of pictures of this thing floating around. There's not a lot of stories about this car floating around. So, you know, for the most part, we're assuming that this thing stayed in his garage and it was just kind of a toy for him. So now, more than 50 years later, this car is on the track several times a year, and it allows Robert to tell the story of how he kind of stumbled upon this thing. And the fact that that original paint is still hanging on, that really makes this thing tell its own story. So I hope you've enjoyed following along with the history of the Zorro's Charger Kellison drag car, originally based out of the Nashville, Tennessee area, now based out of the Chattanooga, Tennessee area, and putting smiles on people's faces on a regular basis.